Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of AACRAO's Credential Chats. And we have a fun one, team. Well, I can't promise it'll be fun. It'll definitely be weird. That we're teeing up for you this episode with Taylor Kendal. He is president of the Learning Economy Foundation, makers of LearnCard, and some tools that I'm also really excited about. Taylor, thank you for joining us on Credential Chats.
Of course. Thanks for making space and hosting. Yeah.
Absolutely. And folks, I know for anybody who doesn't know Taylor, before be joining Learning Economy Foundation, you came from post-secondary world of higher ed. But maybe you could just to kick us off, Taylor, give us the kind of quick rundown of just what Learning Economy Foundation is and the space you're occupying with LearnCard in the innovative credential space.
Sure. And I'll be brief on sort of the backstory, but I sort of have now decent bookends across three chapters that I see as a progression towards the work currently. Spent nearly a decade working on a project with the Library of Congress, which was mostly K-12 PD. Then that bridged into like formal post-secondary, both sort of change management as well as some curriculum design that then led into teaching at CU Denver. So that's sort of chapter two saw uh, post-secondary by way of the Auraria campus in Denver. Uh, Spent a small bit of time sort of at the state level looking at just emerging technology, and that led into helping support a summit at the U.S. Department of Education. The rest is history. Have been focused on Learning Economy Foundation since then, which was really more of an R&D project for 6 or 7 years, and I think had a gravity for those that really were trying to rethink what education and learning and knowledge was and could ultimately become. For us, it's as literal as the namesake. What would new economic systems look like where learning and skills were the currency? So we've been on a pretty exciting ride over the last year and a half, kind of coming out of R&D mode into building and sort of deploying a few different open source public goods. One being LearnCard. This is a learning passport, agency mobility. This is sort of the core vision. And then LearnCloud, which is just some of the deeper data infrastructure, connecting systems, allowing data to move fluidly and be valuable where it needs to.
And Taylor, when you're harking back there to that summit that you helped put on in Washington D.C., I remember getting to attend that in summer of July of 2019. That was all exploring from the Department of Education point of view, blockchain education. Fast forward to January of 2020 was the first time I heard of learning economy and hearing about this. How might we, you know, take these assertions of learning and to your point, use that for economic mobility and to help people. And one of the questions that I remember, being front of mind with both of these things is okay, as we're doing things that are trusted, verifiable, tamper evident or even immutable. Also, how do we, make sure that we're not being exploitative of this data about people and how do we protect privacy? I know that that's been one of your really big kind of passion points. And so, when you think about privacy from a personal perspective or from LEF, what is, from the perspective of credential innovation, and what's kind of top of mind for you on that privacy piece and credential innovation?
Yeah. We were saying before, man, this alone deserves hours, days, for good reason, though. I mean, privacy and data and identity and these things are as complex as it gets. And I think, uh, you know, both problems to be solved and like also, I think, opportunity in the current landscape where there's a lot of, I think, unstable ground underneath us when it comes to just data sovereignty, data privacy. What does it mean for me as an individual to trust that the things I'm saying I have done and learning to like feel those things are valid, and on the other side for that stuff to ultimately be of use for others, and that whether it's an employer or an institution, obviously core to what AACRAO represents, and excited for Infuse and some of these projects that are really trying to think holistically about this stuff. So yeah, I mean, how do I think about privacy? I am a lifelong believer, and it's folks know I like to wear a lot of hats. That's both an enjoyable part of my morning because I like to think about who I want to be that day. But it's also, I think, the lived reality for folks. Like, who am I in the world? We have like core anchors of identity, and we want to keep those things to ourselves often. There are layers that should be private, but we also want to have like gates that we can open up and reveal certain parts about myself, and let some of that identity flow, as it were. Uh, so for us, and that comes in the form of data and badges and credentials, and so the needle we're threading, and I think the fun work we're doing, and this comes out of some work with Lego Foundation and working with kids around applications and games and things that ultimately do uh, both allow for like the multitude of identities that we all inhabit, but also, you know, uh, put in place the protections and the guardrails across various jurisdictions, and whether it's single institutions to states to countries, like there are policies for good reason, and there are that landscape is evolving as well. So that's honestly the biggest unlock, and part of the work at hand is to both allow for that complexity of identity, and also at the same time allow for those identities and the things that represent you to flow fluidly, safely, with with verifiability, all the things that come with, I think, some of the open standards and things that we all kind of love and embrace in the world of LERs and verifiable credentials. So
And
that's a high
maybe
level, yeah, high level overview,
and
but like we do not have it solved yet. We're working on it.
well, I'd love if you could just going back to that Lego Foundation project, the proof of concept there, because I remember seeing that and thought, wow, in my consulting days, I was on a lot of K-12 projects, and you know, companies would say, we only want to deal with, students who are already in high school, like students who are under 14. We have zero interest in story, in any kind of, data around this. And, when I remember reading about this project that you all led to create a proof of concept of a digital wallet for, 7 to 13-year-olds, if I remember correctly. And so maybe just briefly, if you could touch on that and kind of the key issues that was seeking to solve.
Yeah, I mean that was I guess a big piece of the origin from sort of really being deeply in R&D mode into starting to really practically put these things into tools that are fun and usable. Uh, Super skills, which folks can still kind of go dig up and look at some of the sort of evolution of that work, and then also some research that came out the other side. Uh, you know, that for us was like, if we're going to solve some of the hardest data and privacy challenges, this needs to matter for the youngest kids. What it is, I mean, you're absolutely right in that framing that often folks are like, why even like put our necks out? Why even tackle that? But what a disservice to not see people as, you know, a sort of continuous evolution over time, cradle to gray, as our CEO Allison, COO Allison likes to say. And it's true. So I think for us, that was like, yeah, a really important pivotal project to say, let's really roll our sleeves up when it comes to some of the hardest privacy challenges with younger audiences, you know, in a fun space that didn't have some of the, I guess, uh, regulatory sort of overhead, given that it was sort of tied into the Lego ecosystem. Um, and yeah, cool opportunity. John Goodwin, who was the CEO of Lego Foundation at that point, was catalytic in helping us get that project up and moving. He then came on to chair our board and has been a really important sort of strategic advisor, anchoring that work into our current work and how we think about privacy and identity from that point now, all the way through to post-secondary and adults and workforce and all the rest. So yeah, foundational flagship sort of project that was, very much sort of R&D, but then I think almost everything under the hood from a like technical perspective with LearnCard and LearnCloud, we can point to a lot of that work as being the foundation.
Well, and it's all open source, as you said before, which I think is really great. And yeah, I hear you balancing, from, the Office of the Registrar Brain, things like FERPA and these, we need to take privacy very, seriously. And, when my parents moved a couple of years ago, I mean, I was lucky that my mom was kind of a hoarder. And so I had a sixth grade memory box with all these, achievements and recognitions that I got at the time that, in a digital world, if we have LERs starting, in those younger years to be able to help us access opportunities, understand ourselves, navigate towards our successful futures, to not be able to digitally recognize those also would feel like a miss. Um,
Yeah.
you know,
And it's both. I would say like ephemerality matters too. So it's not that it's really one or the other. It's the awareness, transparency, and like true agency to have some of that control, or for guardians or parents to have visibility into that. So anyway, yeah, it's not like it's one or the other, but yeah, I think the choice to be forgotten is actually a really big piece of it too.
mm. And I'm grateful that I just learned the word ephemerality because I think earlier this morning I used the word ephemeralness and it felt wrong, and now I know why. Uh,
I think
what
ephemeralness is okay too, isn't it? I don't know. Yeah.
we probably only have time for just a little bit more, but you touched earlier, used this word sovereignty. And,
Hmm.
I remember, you might have been one of the first people I heard use it, basically since my British literature before 1600 class in college. But when we think about, in this world of learning employment records and credential innovation, this notion of identity and sovereignty, that is, I think, starting to really show up, not only in the world of credentials, but in a lot of the work that our offices are doing in post-secondary institutions, around just who is somebody and how do we know they are who they are, and is that the same person who earned this credential? What's the kind of your thoughts on that and just sort of the important conversations that you're seeing in the world of LERs around this sovereignty situation, and maybe just an explainer of what sovereignty is for people who are only thinking about royals.
Yeah. I mean, I would not consider myself an expert necessarily on the evolution of the word, uh, but certainly in as it relates to some of our work, uh, I first encountered that as even sort of a notion coming out of the like, crypto and blockchain space, to your point, in that 2018-19 timeframe, uh, a book that was sort of foundational called The Sovereign Individual really kind of opened me up to a different lens on what it means to sort of take back my personhood, myself. We all sort of encounter institutions and different people and all these things that sort of uh, add masks often to who we are. Uh, and sometimes those masks get fused in a way that's really hard, I think, to even see them or remove them. So it came out of sort of interesting technical and very nerdy landscape in that time frame, just because I think that whole sort of movement was driven by more of a sort of radical individualism, libertarian sort of mindset. Fast forward, all the sort of self-sovereign identity movement, which actually has recently kind of gained, I think, some new energy, um, disconnected, I think, from a lot of the uh, aspirational kind of crypto and Web3 stuff that I think we learned a lot from, but also learned where it wasn't as useful or wasn't the right direction. So I think, yeah, moving into current sort of 2026, uh, LER realities, I think this is another sort of thread the needle, best of both worlds moment to both allow for sort of individual agency and sovereignty and my true ownership and awareness of what a credential or any piece of data, a specific skill, what that is and why it's mine, and sort of how that creates a core piece of my identity. And I think you're disconnected from like why we still need institutions and registrars and these anchors of trust. And we've been sort of really working towards this narrative of it is, it can, with some of the new open standards, things like decentralized identifiers and some of these, standards that have been incubating, it can absolutely be the best of both worlds where I have control when and why I need it. And that, can also be that data or that representation can also be trusted, verifiable, and, mirrored on the institutional side or the trusted authority side of that equation. Um, and even a little, it doesn't need to be both those things in a perfect world. I think even getting a little closer to uh, individual ownership and control alongside transparency into the value of why that might be useful from an institutional perspective at a school, at a college. That combination, it's pretty hard to point to where those things are really happening. Often right now, it's like I kind of know my identity on like Instagram and Meta owns my data there, and I kind of know my identity or what it represents at Z Boulder, for example, but that's like kind of institutionally owned, and I have to often pay for access to, say, a transcriptor. So just blending those worlds in a better way is, I think, part of certainly what we're trying to achieve, and we're starting to really map towards why that's going to be valuable. It's not theoretical now. We have a lot of projects that are like, yeah, over that hump of speculation.
When it sounds also just, and I know we're just down to about our final 40 seconds here, but it sounds like we're really a narrative that isn't being told enough, maybe, is that this is about trust, this is about transparency, this is about cutting down on fraud. This is about protecting, learning records. And, so much of what we're seeing in this space of credential innovation is about centering the learners. And that, for all of these institutional priorities that this is serving, it also is very much centering and putting forth what's in the best interest of individual human learners.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. It's both. I truly believe those that lean into giving more agency and not giving, recognizing why that's important for an individual is only going to elevate the reputation and trust of, a sort of trusted authority, whether it's a school or an organization, a company like Lego. Like it's only going to be of benefit both to the individual and that organization to not draw hard lines and not put up walls. For us, it's like bridges, not walls. We've built a lot of walls, and there's a lot of moats that everybody encounters, sometimes unknowingly. Um, and now I think, especially in the age of AI with what's coming, like we better start collectively building bridges.
Hmm.
To me, that's an existential sort of act at this point. It's no longer a nice to have. This is like we're on a dangerous line if we don't move that direction, or at least start to signal that that's the future we want.
Well, I think the balance there is a good place to end on just the future we want versus the dangerous line, and that it's bridges and moats. I really appreciate you taking the time, Taylor Kendal, president of Learning Economy Foundation, for joining us on this episode of AACRAO's Credential Chats.